After America is made on the lands of the Kure, Wurrung, Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples, we pay our respects to elders past and present and acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded.
We are in a battle for the soul of America.
This is a fraud on the American public.
Hi, I'm Angus Blackman, and this is After America. Australians are so often told that we share values with the United States. Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Defence Richard Marles has said that Australia and the United States share the values of democracy and the rule of law. In the White House last month, the PM said much the same thing.
And this is a relationship that's been forged in the battlefields of the world. We have stood side by side for freedom and democracy.
But what do Australians think? Today, the Australia Institute is releasing some new polling on Australia's relationship with the United States. Trump, meanwhile, keeps being Trump.
Well, thank you very much. It's a great honor to be with a friend of mine, really for a long time now, if you think about it. The very, very distinguished and respected president of China.
What can I say? It was an outstanding group of decisions, I think, that was made. A lot of decisions were made. There wasn't too much left out there. And we've come to conclusion on many very important points, and we'll be handing that to you in a little while.
The president met with his Chinese counterpart Xi Jinping in South Korea last week. So we've got a two-parter for you today. To take us through what is happening in China-US relations, Emma is joined by two of our colleagues from the Australia Institute, Dr. Frank Yuan and Allan Behm. But first up, here's Emma and me on what Australians think about the Trump administration and the Australia-America relationship. Emma, how are you?
I'm okay, Angus. How are you?
I'm well. I'm moving. And so for anyone who's watching a clip of this later, I swear my living situation doesn't give incel as badly usually. It's pretty sparse. But, one day I'll not be sitting on the second cheapest camp chairs from Bunnings in my living room, but not this day.
One day you'll have a credibility bookcase.
Yeah. I haven't written any, so I'll never have the credibility of you. So we are often told that the Australia-US relationship is built on shared values. But today we polled on it. We have some numbers to see just how true or not that is. What have we found?
We do have some interesting numbers, Angus. So we asked Australians specifically about something Richard Marles had said on ABC's afternoon briefing a while ago when he said that Australia and the United States share values and specified that those values were democracy and the rule of law. So we used that one example, but as you said, there are plenty. Just a couple of weeks ago in the White House, the Australian Prime Minister was talking about how Australia and the US stood side by side for freedom and democracy. So we hear this all the time, and we wanted to test what Australians think about that under the Trump administration specifically. And we got some pretty interesting numbers. Only 8% of Australians are convinced by this statement that Australia and the United States share values. So only 8% strongly agreed with that. And the total number of disagrees we got with that, so strongly disagree or disagree, is 49%. So close enough to half of Australians disagree that we share values with the United States under the Trump administration.
And I've got the numbers in front of me now too. And I think one of the things that I think is interesting is the probably high proportion of people who don't know or aren't sure about it.
Yeah, that's right. And this is something that we'll come back to again and again with these new polling numbers that we've got, is that people are, it seems to me the numbers suggest that people are pretty unsettled by what is happening in the United States. So 19% don't know or aren't sure if we share values with the United States. And I don't have a direct comparison to several decades past, but instinctively I would think that number, as you suggested, is pretty high.
Yeah, to have only 32% of people agree that we share values of democracy and the rule of law with the United States seems pretty low to me.
I think so. Only 1 in 3 people think that we share values with the United States. And I think given the kind of don't knows and not sures, and also probably the specifics of the question, again, that seems like a low number to me.
Yeah, and I think polling people call them crosstabs, diving kind of deeper into, I don't know, maybe they do, maybe they don't. Someone will no doubt correct me via email. We've got some information on what ALP voters specifically thought.
Yes, yeah. So we have all of these answers broken down by things like age, geography, gender, and voting intention as well. And those who intend to vote for Labor, that number is particularly interesting because, of course, we have a Labor government in Australia, and only 7%, so slightly less than the national average of people intending to vote for the ALP at the next election strongly agree that we share values with Donald Trump's United States. And the percentage that disagree, both strongly and just generally disagree that we share values, is higher than the national average. It's 54% compared to the national number of 49%. So a higher number of ALP voters, 54%, disagree with the Labor Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Defence that we share values with Donald Trump's United States.
I think that's interesting. And I mean, democracy and the rule of law are sort of conceptual, they're not, they don't have a practical kind of day-to-day impact on people's lives while they're doing the washing or whatever. But interestingly, this kind of result is backed up by some pretty practical implications in terms of Australians' level of comfort with travelling to the United States at the moment. What did the numbers show us?
Yeah, so these are really interesting numbers, Angus. And I think you're right to point out the kind of esoteric nature or potentially esoteric nature of democracy and the rule of law. Like, can we even call those things values? I don't know. But that's why we wanted to ask this more practical question. And also, for me, it was driven by interest because anecdotally, I keep getting asked by people, should I go to the United States? Is it safe for me to travel to the United States? And I wanted to, have more than just anecdotal evidence for that being a preoccupation for people. And so we asked people directly how safe they would feel traveling to the United States. And half of Australians in this survey came back and said they would feel unsafe traveling to the United States, which, again, we don't have a direct comparison because this is the first time that we've asked that specific question. And I think, Australians have probably always had a little bit of trepidation or reluctance when it comes to traveling to the United States, particularly because of gun violence. Like, this is something I wrestled with and have written about quite a lot before I went to the United States in 2018, particularly because I was taking my then 2-year-old. So I think, that level of concern has always existed. But half of respondents feeling unsafe feels pretty high to me. And I think that's a direct response to, what we're seeing coming out of the United States. And again, anecdotally, I've had so many people ask me, like, should I go? Am I going to get in? Am I going to be okay? And I can't really answer that because the point is, I don't know. And I think I feel it personally as well. Like, I would be really reluctant to go. We've talked about it with lots of people, even on this show, that, going, you have to have a really good reason for going. And even then it would be a really big risk. Like, would someone like me who, is very critical of the Trump administration, would I even make it out of the airport? Like, that's a live question for so many people. And I think these numbers back that up.
Yeah, for sure. We've talked about this on the show previously a little while back, but I'm still getting the Visit USA ads. And it feels like a cruel joke a little bit because, like, I don't know if I'm getting in, guys. Like, I think the algorithms sending you barking up the wrong tree. Too much of you in my social media feeds to be able to get let in, I feel like.
It's just responding to that incel energy, maybe, I guess.
Maybe,
but also,
maybe.
I mean, I've just seen a headline today on Friday as we're recording saying that the Trump administration is going to significantly drop the number of refugees that it's accepting into the United States and, what do you know, increase the number of white South Africans that it is granting visas to. So checks out.
Yeah. Another thing we asked about in the polling was about United States democracy and whether or not people believed that the United States has become more or less democratic under President Donald Trump. 15% came back saying they thought the United States has become more democratic under Donald Trump. All I'm saying is I want to have a beer with them and work out what's going on because I don't know. I'm not so convinced. I mean, each their own. People have their entitled to their own views, but that seems like a stretch from my perspective.
It does seem like a stretch. And I mean, maybe that's reflective of an ideological disposition. Certainly some adherence to the culture wars might suggest that, with Donald Trump's war on woke, the United States has become more democratic. But that's certainly not the majority opinion, which I think is more in line with the evidence in front of us. So half of Australians, again, just like the half that wouldn't feel safe in the United States, half of Australians think that the United States has become less democratic under Donald Trump.
Yeah.
We are great friends and we're great allies. And this is a relationship that's been forged in the battlefields of the world. We have stood side by side for freedom and democracy.
Can you guarantee Australia will get the votes?
Oh, it's getting. Oh, no, they're getting it.
So Donald Trump says it's full steam ahead for AUKUS, but sitting at the same table, his Navy Secretary John Phelan was mentioning the need to clarify some of the ambiguity. What are the ambiguities?
Well, firstly, I think President Trump answered that question emphatically. We are working very closely with the United States in respect of AUKUS.
Of course Trump loves the AUKUS deal. He gets $3 billion US, he gets a base in Western Australia, he gets a dockyard in Western Australia. And yes, he'd love to sell us some submarines, of course he would, but he doesn't have any obligation to sell us to them unless his Navy can spare them.
We're going to talk to Allan, Behm and Frank Yuan about the United States and China shortly. But before we do that, I wanted to talk a little bit about AUKUS too, because we've got some results back on that. And it seems like people seem kind of less clear about AUKUS. Is that right?
Yeah, that's my general takeaway from these numbers, Angus. So about 1 in 3 Australians still don't know if the AUKUS submarine deal is in our best interests or if it makes us safer.
That's really interesting because this is a huge project, something like the most significant transfer of sovereign wealth to another country in Australia's history.
Yep.
And to have that many people be a bit meh or a bit unsure about it, I would feel like that would worry me if I was the government.
Yeah, I mean, I think it should be at least a little bit concerning that less than half of Australians think AUKUS is in Australia's best interest or makes us safer. And I think when you put that alongside some of our other results, like we asked Australians how reliable or unreliable they think the United States is as a security ally, and only 16% of respondents thought that the United States was a very reliable security ally. So, when you're handing over $368 billion roughly, I guess you would hope that people would see that the nation you're handing over that amount of money to is very reliable, and that's just not borne out by the numbers.
And Anthony Albanese has obviously recently been to the United States, met with President Donald Trump. Do we see any evidence of that having an impact or any potential evidence of that having an impact in the results? I
think we do, Angus. Actually, we've spoken a bit on the show about how that meeting was successfully framed as being very successful. That Donald Trump had confirmed or guaranteed the AUKUS submarine deal, and much of the media coverage and analysis reflected that viewpoint. And the Australian government has been at pains to reinforce that. And I think of course I'm drawing inferences because we didn't ask directly, but I think we're seeing that reflected in some of the numbers. So we also asked Australians, again, we've asked this before, if they would support or oppose an Australian parliamentary inquiry into the AUKUS agreement. And the numbers are high. So over half of Australians, 53%, support or strongly support the idea of a parliamentary inquiry into AUKUS. And only 16% of Australians are opposed or strongly opposed to that view. So the numbers are clear there where support lies, but that is a little bit of a drop on the last time that we asked this question in July 2025 when net support, so strong support or support, was at 66%. So we have seen a drop there, and I suspect that is a response to this idea that the alliance has been stabilised by the government and that Trump has guaranteed those submarines. But I think there's a couple of other things to draw out from that. Once again, more Australians are not sure whether they would support a parliamentary inquiry. So answered don't know or not sure. That's up 3% on the last time we asked this question. And I think importantly for the current government, given what we're seeing in the Labor Party's rank and file, net support for a parliamentary inquiry is actually higher among those intending to vote Labor at the next election. It sits at 61%.
Yeah, right.
So amongst Labor voters, support for a parliamentary inquiry is really quite high.
Yeah, okay, interesting. And we were talking about, I guess, the data in some more detail there. Last time we spoke about polling a few months back, we talked about women and how the results suggested that women were overall less keen on Trump.
Gee, I wonder why.
Has that continued this time around?
I think it has, to no one's great surprise. Women are more concerned about Donald Trump and what he's doing. And that comes out in a few ways in the results that we've got. So when we asked that question about how safe you would feel traveling to the United States, there's a pretty big gender gap. So 57% of women responded that they would feel unsafe traveling to the United States compared to 45% of men. And the other interesting one that stood out to me, Angus, was around the question of AUKUS and whether respondents thought the AUKUS security agreement would make Australia more or less safe. 57% of men think that AUKUS makes Australia safer compared to 36% of women. I am pretty tempted to make a dick joke about that, but this is a high-minded security analysis podcast, so we won't do that, will we?
We're very serious people.
Very serious.
Well, on that curious note, we might end this part of the conversation here and get into your conversation with Allan Behm and Frank Yuan. Here it is.
So I am joined in the studio today in real life by Allan Behm, who's Special Advisor on International Affairs here at the Australia Institute. Allan, welcome.
Thank you, Emma.
Lovely to see you. And we're also joined today by Dr. Frank Yuan, who is a postdoctoral researcher here at the Australia Institute. It's lovely to have you on the show finally, Frank.
Thank you, Emma. It's great to be here.
It's great to be here in person as well, very rare occasion. So we are here today, of course, to talk about the big summit that Donald Trump has had with the Chinese president. And I wanted to start by asking you, Allan, Trump and Xi met in South Korea last week. What did we learn?
I don't think we learnt anything. It was much ado about nothing, really. The measure of success seemed to really have been the amount of time they took to get to nowhere. And at the moment, that's a pretty cynical thing of me to say, I presume. But in fact, we are riding through a set of tipping points globally at the moment, and the leaders of the two most powerful nations really have got a lot more to do than simply have a quiet meeting where they don't appear to have talked about very much at all and come out with very little, when there is so much that is worrying everybody, not least of all the potential that they both have to massively destroy each other. They can compete as much as they like in trade. That's probably quite a good thing. But when you turn that into a pretext for armed conflict, that's a very bad thing, very dangerous. And so they didn't really seem to engage on what the reality is underpinning everybody's concern at the moment. And I think that when you have the President of the United States essentially go in without an agenda, except perhaps to talk a bit about tariffs, and the President of China to go in with what I suspect was an agenda, but an agenda that he didn't have to deliver on, then you have effectively nothing coming out the back end. And that's why I'm very disappointed in the nature and the quality of the so-called dialogue between the two leaders of the two most powerful nations in the world. What a wasted opportunity.
So you don't buy all the talk of a big deal made by Trump the peacemaker?
No, I mean, for Trump, everything is performative. Everything is about the optics. I mean, if we go back just a couple of weeks earlier with the Australian Prime Minister meeting the President, not in the Oval Office this time, but at least at the White House, that also was optical. There was not any real substance in that except a vague promise that sometime down the road, rare earths will be mined in Australia by the private sector, essentially. There was no discussion about what the investment regime would look like, certainly no discussion about any taxes that they might want to pay and whether Australia will get anything out of what it might do with rare earths, except support the United States in being able to manage its electronics industry. So where you have this sort of performative approach to meetings for the sake of meetings, and you simply throw the word deal at them and tell everybody that there's a deal, well, you're just tricking everyone. And everyone sits around and they know that there's no deal, but they don't know what's happened. But they don't take any comfort out of it that anyone's in control of the sort of chaos that's whirling around and has everybody so disconcerted.
Yeah, disconcerted is the word. Frank, Allan mentioned there that, Trump is relatively easy to understand in that he wants the symbolism, he wants a deal, but the substance is not particularly of interest to him. You've been following US-China relations very closely. Do you think that relationship has changed since Trump was elected?
I would say it largely remained the same in terms of its fundamental settings. To me, the signals from the Trump administration looks more mixed and more fluctuating, right? So Trump himself, as he has more or less consistently done in his first term, generally downplays the geopolitical tension between US and China and very much plays up his personal rapport, to put it lightly, with President Xi Jinping. On the other hand, there are people within the Trump administration and people who, for all we know, get on fairly well with Trump, like Secretary of War now, no longer Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, and Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent. Every now and then they come out and say something that presents a more confrontational or perhaps a more adversarial type of relationship between the two countries. And from China, I see mostly consistency from before Trump's election and certainly from before the beginning of Trump's second term in the White House. So they seem to be playing up their desire for a stable relationship with the United States. Now, on the other hand, in terms of what they are doing, they are now, I think, more willing to take risks in terms of engaging in tit-for-tat tactics to push back on Trump's trade offensive and other means to pressure China. So they are now engaged in that sort of tactic, which is, I think, a contrast from during Trump's first term when, in 2018, when the US started putting trade restrictions or export controls on high-tech products to China. At the time, China pretty much just rolled with the punches, but didn't push back. This time, every step of the way, they had something up their sleeve that they would use and deploy. So that's what led to, a week or so before Trump and Xi's meeting in Korea, China deployed its restriction on rare earth export to perhaps its fullest possible extent, or threatened to do so. Now, that crisis was averted, of course, with the meeting of the two presidents, but it's a demonstration of China's willingness to perhaps up the ante in that increasingly unstable relationship, at least on the economic front.
And where do you think, Frank, that willingness comes from? When I'm asked about this, it's so often framed to me as an issue of simple power relations, that Xi comes to this from a position of greater power than Trump because of the vulnerabilities of the US economy. Is that what is driving that willingness to respond, do you think, or is something else going on?
So there's certainly an element of this, and it's the sense that I get in certain types of communications from China, especially on the more hawkish side of the media and commentary. But I think there's also a sense that China is now at a point where it cannot simply retreat and hope that the US will just let it off the hook. I think there's a sense that China has to now use its increased leverage to push back on the US. And they have, for sure, developed since 2018, when the first Trump administration started its trade offensive, they have developed and diversified its supply chain for some of its most important sectors and diversified its export portfolio as well, actually. So less reliant on the American market today than they were a few years ago. Now, China does also face quite a few internal economic challenges, and they're trying to go through this massive economic reform and to deal with the fallout from, the end of the real estate boom.
Mm-hmm.
But I think they judge themselves to be in a reasonably good position to start pushing back and to do so in a way that also helps to manage their vulnerability.
You'll find out very soon, but we're going to do some testing. Yeah, other countries do it. If they're going to do it, we're going to do it.
Okay, you can't clarify whether you will receive.
I'm not going to say yet. I mean, I know exactly what we're doing, where we're doing it, but other countries are doing it, and if other countries do it, we do it.
I think it makes nuclear conflict less likely, and America will ensure that we have the strongest, most capable nuclear arsenal so that we maintain peace through strength. That's what this is.
The Secretary General has been saying for some time now that current nuclear risks are already alarmingly high, and all actions that could lead to miscalculation or escalation with catastrophic consequences must be avoided.
Just on that, Allan, and the the willingness to respond and the context that Frank mentioned there of the China hawks, if we can call them that, in the Trump administration, including the likes of Pete Hegseth. Lots of the focus has been on tariffs and, strongman tactics when it comes to tariffs. But Trump has also just announced, I believe on the way back from this meeting, the resumption or the potential resumption of nuclear testing by the United States. China has significantly expanded its nuclear arsenal in recent years, and there are reports as well that Russia has just tested nuclear-capable, nuclear-powered missiles and drones. That all seems pretty bad.
It is pretty bad because it has no boundaries to it. It's pretty bad because we don't know what they're talking about, and I strongly suspect that they don't know what they're talking about either.
That became clear as Trump was asked questions,
absolutely.
follow-up questions.
I mean, Trump said that he wants to be able to test nuclear weapons on an equal basis with the others. Well, there hasn't been a nuclear weapons test in well over 30 years now, and for very good reason. They don't need to test the nuclear weapons anymore because you have a mixture of non-destructive testing, that's component testing, and really highly advanced computer modelling of nuclear explosions done by supercomputers. You really don't need to blow the ground up or put it up in the air. So I'm not sure that Trump knew what he was talking about. And of course, everyone else was confused because they immediately thought that this was a problem for the Pentagon. But of course it's not. Anybody who knows about where nuclear weapons come from in the United States, they come from the Department of Energy because under statute, that is the organisation responsible for the management and the maintenance of the nuclear arsenal. And on that, the United States still maintains a massive nuclear arsenal, slightly smaller than Russia's because Russia's got a few more clapped-out old weapons in its arsenal that it hopefully wouldn't ever contemplate using. And as Frank said, China is building up its nuclear arsenal, but it still comes a distant third to the other two. They have a capacity to obliterate each other multiple times over. That's the problem. The problem is not whether the loose language around nuclear testing gets everybody excited, as it has got Guterres and others pretty excited. The problem is that if they don't know what they're talking about, none of us know what it means. And that, I think, is very dangerous because it not only plays into uncertainty, and everything is uncertain, but it plays deeply into the ambiguity that both sides are willingly playing to keep the other off balance. And in great power relations, the art form is to manage stability, which is balance, while at the same time maintaining managed ambiguity. You just can't leave it to fate or to accident. And that's why I think that the so-called summit was, from my perspective, a signal failure on both sides because it didn't reduce uncertainty and it didn't manage ambiguity.
I think that's probably a good place now to ask you, Frank, about a piece of work that you've just completed. Speaking of Allan's point about getting the facts and actually understanding what things mean, a radical idea. You've just released a paper on the South China Sea, which of course is an issue that comes up all the time in US-China relations and in China-Australia relations.
Yep.
So I wanted to start by asking you a basic question, because I think so much of our conversation about this assumes knowledge that maybe doesn't necessarily exist. So what is the South China Sea and why is it important?
So the South China Sea is a body of water to the south of the Chinese mainland and is surrounded by countries including Vietnam, Malaysia, Indonesia, Singapore is also on the coast of it, and the Philippines, and Taiwan, which China, of course, claims as part of itself. Taiwan sits off the northeast corner of the South China Sea. It's an important body of water for global trade, and much of that trade does go in or out of China. And it's also a place where China and its neighbors, including Vietnam, Malaysia, Brunei, and the Philippines, have territorial disputes.
Mm-hmm. And what did your report find?
The report found that the South China Sea dispute very much predates the past 10 or so years when it's emerged as a major source of international tension, including tension between the US and China. But it has a long history before that, and indeed it predates the founding of the People's Republic, which was when the Communist Party of China established the government in 1949. Now, when it did that, it inherited the claims of the previous government over the South China Sea. We also found that much of the tension in recent years, it can be tracked to this web of interaction between multiple parties, right? So China certainly did contribute to it through the way it's used its military and paramilitary forces, but it's one of the many actors in that disputes, in that set of disputes rather, because there also exist disputes between, say, Vietnam and Malaysia. Another thing that I examined was China's interests in the area. So from the perspective of someone, perhaps anyone sitting in Beijing, what would you see as your country's strategic and economic interests? And from there, I try to make some inferences about the future directions of its policy. Now, I also looked at how China's neighbors have been responding to China, right? Because we quite often hear about Australia or the US sending ships or aircraft to patrol the area. But how have the other contending parties of those disputes, how have they been responding? And surprisingly, or perhaps not so surprisingly, given their position and their long history of dealing with China, most of them have found ways to manage the dispute without involving too much coercive force.
Mm-hmm. Allan, you co-authored this report, and one of the aims was, just as Frank said, is to understand this geographic region and the various interests and histories at play here. Why do you think it is so important to understand Chinese and Chinese government perspectives on the region? And I put emphasis there, of course, on understand.
Look, I think there are a host of reasons for that, Emma. Often these sorts of issues are manufactured. They're created in order to unbalance the parties. In this case, the United States is extremely good at trying to keep China unbalanced over issues. It's how it plays Taiwan. It's how it plays the South China Sea issue. It's how it plays force levels in Japan and force levels in South Korea. And for 40, 50 years now, force levels in Japan and South Korea have been kinds of tripwires that set a threshold. And if anybody wants to trip over those tripwires, then we'll go and have a hot war about it. So these things play into the management of the strategic stability of the whole of the area. So that's the first point. The second point is that we've got a lot to learn yet from how China and its neighbours deal with these complex international issues. They deal with each other really very effectively. As Frank just said, they don't resort generally speaking, to coercive means, excepting only between China and the Philippines, where a bit of nudging and bumping and the use of fire hoses and all that sort of thing comes into the management of fishing boats. But for the most part, they've been able to do it without resorting to jet fighters and warships and things of that kind. Australia's in a slightly different position here because we've had a habit in association with our neighbours in Southeast Asia of providing long-range maritime surveillance services to Malaysia and Singapore particularly, but also to Indonesia for the best part of the last 50 years. And we're still at that game, whereas formerly we would use Orion P3C aircraft. We now use big jets, Poseidon aircraft, and these cover enormous areas. They monitor everything that's there and do appear in the enhancement of capability to a country like China to be an enhancement of not only our long-range maritime patrol capacity, but our intention, as it were, to obtrude. And that's how it's looked at. So it's very important that we understand how China does its policy settings so that we actually know what we're doing, that we're not sort of stepping into some kind of dark room incapable of seeing what's around, that we know what the trigger points are, what we're provoking and what we're not, and that we pay attention to how the rest of the Southeast Asians deal with that problem. And so we've had an incident just in the last week where flares were again deployed in the pathway of one of the Poseidon aircraft. That's potentially a dangerous thing to do because potentially if they suck the flares into the jet engines, the aircraft could have a malfunction of one kind or another. So we need to know what we're doing. The Chinese need to know what they're doing, and they need to know the range of signal giving that is actually occurring there. And that's why I think a paper of this kind is so important, so that you don't just stumble into error. If you want to get into error, do it malice aforethought. But in fact, it's better not to get into error. And the way of not getting into error is to know what you're doing. So that's what the paper was for.
Knowing what you're doing is sound advice for anybody. And thank you.
It's strategy 101, Emma. Facts and knowing what you're doing is where you start, not where you end.
A wildly radical concept in today's changing world. Thank you both so much for your time and for your generosity in shining a light on some of these issues. It's much appreciated. Allan, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Emma.
And Frank, thank you so much.
Thanks, Frank.
Thanks so much for joining us for this week's episode. If you want to see more scrutiny of AUKUS, you can sign our petition calling on the federal government to establish a parliamentary inquiry into the deal. The link is in the show notes. We'd love to hear your thoughts on the show. You can reach us via our email address, podcasts@australiainstitute.org.au. My discussion with Emma was recorded on Friday the 31st of October, and Emma's chat with Frank and Allan was recorded on Monday the 3rd of November. After America is supported by the Andrew Farron Foundation. We'll be back next week. I'm Angus Blackman. Thanks for listening.